We have an excellent panel to discuss and build on the opening remarks about where the European Union is heading and Europe as a whole is heading. And unusually, it's there's no German or French presence. So we're getting a Baltic and Scandinavian and British perspective for you this morning, which is probably going to be, in many ways, more instructive than the official German and French line, if I may hazard a guess. So, just briefly, from the Economist's perspective, you know, we've been supporters of the European Union for many decades. In the current situation, we have been sort of early, I think, in alerting the European leadership to the need to actually show leadership early on in addressing what were pretty fundamental questions about the structure of Europe if the euro is to survive. And we, I guess a few months ago, towards the end of last year, were becoming quite alarmed that the failure to show leadership you know, would actually mean that we would get an outcome that would be catastrophic, that the euro would break up in some way. We remain convinced that the euro, sticking together with all its existing members and maybe continuing its expansion to others, you know, is the best option, and that to break it up would have unimaginably bad consequences. But nonetheless, we started to fear that the political leadership of Europe was not going to be able to deliver that outcome. I think more recently, we feel that certainly Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank has won his battle with the Bundesbank and you know, does now have at least the freedom to do the European version of QE and to keep the banking system broadly afloat, and that some of the other political machinations that have gone on, you know, seem to be building on that turning of the corner. So we think the catastrophic risk is dramatically reduced. But now the challenge is what kind of Europe you know, will emerge, how quickly will it emerge? You know, is it going to be a Europe that has economic growth in it, or are we talking, as many European industrialists that I talk to suggest, it's going to be 10 years of no growth before you know, before all the badness is out of the system? And you know, what are the electorates going to want? What is the vision for Europe as a union? And as was hinted at the end of the President's remarks, what's Britain's role going to be, among other things, in that union? So we have this great panel to discuss this, and I wanted to start with the Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Mr. AzubalisH. I mean, you are in the midst, as was mentioned, of an election where the future of Europe is absolutely at the heart of what's being debated, and dare I say it, opinion polls suggest that the public is not currently hugely supportive of the current timetable for joining the euro, which brings you into the euro in 2014. Well, how's that election looking to you at the moment? What do you feel is at stake, and you know, could it be that you won't be going into the euro on 2014?
Our primary goal is to keep economy growing. The goal is the euro itself is not an ultimate goal. The master criteria, which we want to fulfill and follow, itself gives a good guidelines for healthy economy. That's what we are not discussing. 2014, 2015, we are trying to keep our economy growing as it is, because the last year our GDP grew 5.9%. This, the first quarter of this year, 3.9. It looks quite good. The inflation, 2.7. It also looks quite good. And I think that we should continue in the same way. We should continue very responsible fiscal policy. Our state debt consists about 40% of GDP. It's not a bad. And we would like to continue the same. I would say, very responsible financial policy. How the people see this it's difficult for me to judge now. There are different polls which show sometimes, you know, that conservative, Christian, democratic, and liberal coalition is going down. Some polls showing differently. But I want to say one thing, that despite we will lose or not the elections, the major achievement of this government was that we survived our economy, we survived our investments, and even more, we achieved and we got a lot of world-known nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, IT companies coming to Lithuania. And we are proud of that, and now about 20% of our GDP are coming from this kind of new and modern economic. And this is our goal, to keep this. And also, the second challenge is energy security. Why, for example, it's quite difficult for us to fight with the inflation, because, as you know, we are buying gas from one source, from Gazprom, which and paying the biggest price in Europe. We are paying $510 per 1,000 cubic meters, and it's quite tough to sustain, to keep the economy going on. And of course, we are looking to the nuclear. We have this project developing, to LNG, which should be in 2014. I mean, a lot of challenges, and I think that the people, as the Estonian President Alex said, that people are not stupid. They see that we are doing our best, and of course, my wife, my family would like to see the same ministerial salary as it was in socialist time, when the social democratic government was. Now we cut even the ministerial salaries 45%. We even found the agreement. It was a very painful with the pensioners, and we cut pensions. And my father and mother, they are complaining to me. They said, "Look, son, what are you doing? Why you are voting to cut pensions?" I said, "Because we have no other choice. I don't want to see my state bankrupt."
But do you think there is now a possibility that you won't go ahead with the fast-track timetable and the currency will, the union won't be completed in 2014?
Yes, of course. The euro itself, it also gives more trust. When we borrowed, not being Eurozone members, of course, we paid bigger percents. It's obvious, it's understandable. And of course, I would like to see this, but let's do our job consistently, honestly, and we will see the results at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to Mr. Rinkevics of Latvia. You're definitely joining in 2014 the European Union, so the European currency. How do you see the vision for the political evolution of the European Union to support that currency and make it viable as a global reserve currency, hopefully in the long run?
Well, first of all, let me say that the goal is to join Eurozone by 2014. Of course, in order to dance, you have to, first of all, our own decision and will, and of course, decision by the Eurozone. I think that certainly we want to join prosperous, stable Eurozone. We hope that coming months will be a time when actually all the bad things will pass and the Eurozone will turn the corner. But it's also a decision by all 17 Eurozone members. So it's not only a decision by the country, but also this decision has also some kind of political dimension, not only fulfilling Maastricht criteria to have your budget deficit below 3%, inflation below 3%, public debt below 60%. And I'm quite confident that Latvia, by the time of making those decisions, will fulfill all those criteria. Like Audronius has just said, also our economy was growing last year 5.5%. This year we have projection of 4%. Unemployment is going down. So it shows that all those tough measures that have been taken by the government in 2009, 2010, those decisions have been the right ones. When we talk about the rationale of joining Eurozone, I think one is, of course, financial economic aspects. Our trade with Eurozone countries is around 72% of the whole trade. Our industry actually is very much pressing for joining Eurozone for purely economic and financial reasons. But I would also add here some geopolitical considerations. We joined Eurozone, European Union back in 2004. We are a member of two distinct clubs, European Union and NATO. But in order actually to more deeper integrate into European Union, we have to solve actually three distinct issues. First is energy, and Audronius was already mentioning that it's so far Baltic region is energy dependent on Russia. I think we have to sort it out. Second is transportation network. It's also railway network. And third, I would say also the joining common currency is also much deeper integration than only kind of political integration into the European Union. When we speak about what kind of Eurozone we would love to join, I already said stable, prosperous, and predictable one. But in order to do that, I think that we as a European Union have to undergo serious reform. We have a couple of proposals on the table. One is by EU President Herman Van Rompuy, who is talking about actually deeper fiscal union, deeper economic union, deeper also financial union. By that we understand and we fully support the idea about European level banking union. I think that we need a very strong European level regulator. Of course, we have to also look how responsibilities will be divided between European level and national level regulators. Second is financial union, where we see actually, or fiscal union, where we see actually a situation which President Ilves was very much referring, that there have been some countries that have been playing by the rules and some not. We actually love to speak about countries of Southern Europe, but I want to remind that actually by 2005, 2006, Germany and France were two biggest actually violators of the rules. So I think that when we talk about rules, then we have to certainly see a situation where rules are being observed by everyone, that there are mechanisms, sanctions, and also enforcers in this respect. The trouble actually, and also Herman Van Rompuy is talking about that, how much legitimacy we can afford to kind of give to European level structures as a part to national structures. In Latvia, I certainly know that our parliament, our public, would want to have an ultimate say when it comes to national budgets. There are some calls to have European Union actually having ultimate say on national budgets, on where you spend your money. I think that this is something where publics in Europe are not going to accept that. But I think that this is one of more extreme proposals. Well, we have also some discussion about more harmonization of tax policies to put financial transaction taxes. I think that when you get 27, soon 28 countries to debate, it takes about 2.5 hours if you sit at the Foreign Affairs Council for every country just to raise its opinion for 3 minutes. So you can imagine how difficult it is to get any kind of agreement. But one good thing about European Union, even after debates, and the history shows that back to 1950s, at the end of the day, we are able to manage to go further into integration and actually wider into also European Union. Probably one more point what I want to say is that yes, I think that publics all around the world, and definitely in Latvia as well, are reading every day doomsday scenarios about Eurozone, about the European Union. There is certainly a lot of questions, do we have to do that? But I would very much subscribe to the notion that people are not stupid. Politicians sometimes are. And in this respect, I would be more looking at those parties, politicians who are trying to capitalize on some of problems rather than to work on those issues.
Thank you. I was struck. I interviewed President Van Rompuy this time last year when he was in New York, and he said very memorably, you know, the rule in financial crises is that the politicians should always get ahead of the market, but in the European Union, it's constitutionally impossible to get ahead of the market because you just have all these countries having to reach agreement, so you're inevitably going to be going from crisis to crisis if the markets are sort of shaping the coverage of it. And I think that's proven to be the case, but fundamentally he impressed on us all then that this is a political process, fundamentally economically relevant highly, but still essentially a political process. But the question I wanted to push you on was, as you say, I mean, I think it's almost certain that out of this will come a much closer integration of the Eurozone members, at least, within the European Union. Do you think, as particularly some of the southern countries have to give up some of their autonomy in order to be part of that Germany is going to have to, at some point, put some money, significantly more money, into the pot than is currently being certainly discussed in German political debate and so forth?
And I think that in that case we would have to have here in this panel also somebody from Southern Europe to answer that question. But I would say that, and commenting on what you have just said, first of all, I think that there is growing understanding that the current setup, the current structure of the European Union has to be reformed, and that we have to talk not only about deeper fiscal, financial, economic integration, but also we have to address issues of deeper political integration. You have, I just mentioned report by Mr. Van Rompuy, President of the Commission. Barroso was talking about federation, about the United States of Europe. We have foreign ministers of 11 EU countries putting their proposals, so the debate is there. And I think that one good thing is that we have a general understanding that we have to undergo a serious reform, even up to the level of probably concluding a new treaty. Does it mean that this kind of reform has some kind of price tag? Most probably yes. Is German public, and I think that President Ilves was very right when he was describing that you cannot expect in parliamentary democracy somebody doing something. There are coalition governments, parliaments, and public opinion at last. I think that, well, we will see, of course, how things are playing out in German elections next year, first. But I think that a certain political reform has some price tag, and I think that at some point in time we will have to talk also about some more money into it, and this is going to be not only Germany, but I think that's a decision that can be taken by and should be taken by the whole Union. Thank you.
So, Foreign Minister of Norway, as of a few days, Mr. Espen Barth Eide, the Norwegian no position must have felt pretty good the past few years as you stayed outside of this unfolding mess. What does it look now? I mean, you're obviously someone that's historically taken a yes position, but
yeah. Me personally, I've always been in favor, but I belong to an increasingly exclusive club of in my own country. But maybe I should start by saying that there are, if you're a European country west of Belarus and Ukraine, you have two choices. You can either be a member of the EU or you can be an almost member of the EU. That's the two versions that exist. And if you're a member, you can choose to be a member with the euro or without the euro. And if you want to be an almost as a semi-member, you can do that through the European Economic Agreement, which we've done. Which means that we are full part of the internal market, we're full part of the Schengen Agreement, we participate on common foreign security policies, so we are in the broader euro sphere, not as the euro as the currency, but the European political sphere. So this matters as much to us as it does to the members. And we are concerned about the state of affairs in Europe because we noticed this quite directly. Of course, there are certain advantages once you're out. We're now diversifying our economy away from the more traditional partners, more to emerging markets. We have the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and that is now investing in very different places than what it used to do. But still, our primary market is the European market, and our primary political friends are in Europe, and that will remain. So this is important for us. I think Europe is a great idea, and I think Europe is such a great idea that it's important to defend the idea of further integration. But I think we are at the juncture in which we either, or where the Europeans, either go deeper, or we will see the beginning of a de-escalation and a de-integration, which will be terribly nasty. I agree with President Ylvis that the most likely outcome is that integration succeeds. And I think that there is sort of a strongly established elite project in Europe of trying to make integration deeper. And that elite project is so far supported by most of the voters. I mean, let's say that's a 60% chance of this going the right direction. If that's true, there's a 40% chance of the opposite. And I think we should just spell out what that could look like. Because there are now, I mean, now we are among a group of countries here which are either very rich or new countries which are doing very well, although from a lower starting point, and which have shown a very impressive way, really impressive way of adapting to very difficult circumstances over the last years. But there are bigger and more southern countries in Europe where you see massive unemployment. Which is not it's an economic problem to be have unemployment, but it's a social problem. In Spain, which I know very well because my wife is from there, there are now 50% youth unemployment. I have middle-class friends with high education whose kids have high education, and where their parents tell me, we don't think our kids will ever have a job. Now, which is a very, very dangerous thing to say, which means that the generations that are growing up in parts of Europe now are simply expecting that the life of their heirs will be less affluent than they had, and that can have some very negative consequences. It can lead to a gradual lack of trust in the system being the domestic systems or in the European system. That can lead to social unrest, and that can lead to the growth of extremist parties. It's true, as Ilan, I again underline, right now, that's not what's happening, and let's be clear on that. But the danger is, the problem is still out there. And I think the question is, will the Save the Euro program not only succeed, but succeed in time, before these sort of counter currents are taking over and dominating? Now, this is a deep problem for Europe, but it would be a terrible problem for America as well, which is why you should be concerned. Because after all, even with a more multipolar world and the change of economic gravity, there are no countries politically closer, I think, to America than the European countries. And collectively, we are losing ground internationally. Together, the West used to have more than 60% of world GDP. Now I think we're at 45, but the trend is going down, and projected to be down maybe in the 30s by mid-century. Now, that's not necessarily dramatic, but it means that our common cloth is going down. And to see this together means that it is very important now that the political forces that are trying to make the program survive and make it stronger are actually now going to be dominant in Europe. That matters to us. We have no unemployment. We have a very beneficial economic situation, but that will not last forever. And we're acutely aware that these trend lines, if they actually set in, cannot be buffered by having
let me push you a bit on that. I mean, firstly, what do you think needs to happen to start the job engine going again within the European Union in a timely fashion? And secondly, you mentioned America. I mean, what would you want America to be doing more than it's doing at the moment to support the European economy?
Well, I mean, I guess this problem has to be solved in Europe. But of course, there's I think there's the rules that was already. I mean, the problem began in Europe as in America as the financial crisis, which then moved into the real economy. We didn't have a problem in the real economy, but we had a problem in the financial economy. So of course, thorough regulations, and I think President Obama has set some good standards for regulating these services, which European countries may want to copy. And I think that a growth can actually only happen after getting the institutions and the structures right. And it's a race against time in a sense, because there are certain austerity measures that has to happen. But we have to recognize while that happens that these sort of social consequences are accumulating. And at some stage this must turn into an impulse. And you know, again, I will not be able to describe exactly when that can happen, but we have to be very aware, and I think that's my main point, very aware of the downside of just going on down the track that's going.
And presumably, I mean, if America were to elect a government with a strong austerity agenda, that would be pretty bad for the European situation.
Yes.
So, EideMichala Marcussen, Chief Economist of Societe Generale. Firstly, I mean, do you share my sense that the monetary policy challenge, you know, the corner has been turned now, and that the European Central Bank is, you know, is empowered to pursue a QE and a supporting policy for the banking system that should help that part of the economic situation be solved? And then secondly, I want to move on to the question of where on earth are the jobs going to come from in Europe that are going to keep the political process able to stay on track?
I would say I have slightly mixed feelings about the ECB. On the one hand, I think it's very welcome, the initiative that Draghi has taken with the OMT. And I think what we've seen is that at every turn of this crisis, the ECB has answered the question where the funding comes from. So if we go back to the beginning, Trichet gave us first the long LTRO. Then President Trichet gave the SMP. Then Draghi gave the LTRO 3. Then Draghi has now given us the OMT, which is a different version of SMP. So if we think of every step of the crisis, the ECB...
They just stick to QE in America. It's much simpler. You just add another number.
Well, you see, I disagree with you that it's QE, and there the ECB would agree with me that it is not QE, because it is trying to do something very different. It is trying to address the fragmentation in the European financial markets. So deliberately, it's not focused on longer maturity issues. It's deliberately focused on the 1 to 3 year. Now, where I think the ECB is doing something which could potentially be a little bit dangerous is it also takes the pressure off governments. And what I personally would have liked to see, and this is what I'm looking for over the next year, I would say I have a checklist of events. I would have liked to see the Prime Minister Rajoy come out and say, Spain is going to do all these things, ask for this package, get things sorted out and advanced. I think that, unfortunately, we've come to a point where avoiding a package for Spain will be extremely difficult, and the markets are likely to push until a clear resolution is put in place. I would like to see that happen quickly. I would also like the governments to very quickly deliver a credible plan on Greece. I would also like to see the banking union advance quickly. I would also like to see the fiscal union advance quickly. I would like to see a reform-oriented government elected in Italy, and I won't go on my list, but you can see I do have a long checklist here for 2013.
How many of them do you expect to happen
Well, you see,
quickly?
that's where I think the ECB, it's very welcome, but it's also a little bit dangerous, because what we've seen so far in this crisis is when we've taken the pressure away, taken away the market pressure, what we have seen is a little bit of what I would call foot dragging from the political sphere. Now, I think we can all understand that. And, you know, you mentioned your interview with President Van Rompuy, but I think what's interesting is look at the United States, look at the fiscal cliff. How are we doing here in a country with just one government and just one fiscal cliff, and in tackling that? There's more foot dragging going on. And I think that's the difficulty that we face. Now, you raised the question of economic growth, and I think Europe has two challenges, but very intertwined. There's an institutional challenge, and I pretty much agree with everything that's been said about the Maastricht Treaty not being a sustainable framework for the future. But there's also very much an economic challenge, and that is a challenge that is common to all the advanced economies. We're coming out of a balance sheet recession. If you look back and you think of what we as a generation have done, we built up debt in the OECD economies, and it's not just public sector debt, it's private sector debt as well, from just under 180% of GDP to close to 300%. That was fun. That was really good. It's always a lot of fun to take out debt and spend. What's less fun is when you have to rein it back in. And there's no real good way around it unless you can generate the growth. And this is where Europe has a challenge. Now, one idea is that we could try and go for sequential deleveraging, which is what the US is presumably doing right now. But I think
they're not doing the second sequence yet. That's
well,
the
no,
problem,
this is the
isn't it?
thing. It's a sequential deleveraging, and we're getting to that next sequence, which is challenging. And at the same time, we're not seeing the economy really lift out of what I call stall speed, for lack of a better terminology. But what I would emphasize is I think Europe has real opportunity through structural reform. Now, I was reassured when I heard earlier that when you do the right thing, you do get re-elected. Obviously, I'm an economist. I'm not a politician. I'm not always so sure that that is the case. I have seen governments thrown out for doing unpopular structural reform, and you said you don't have anyone French or German up here. Well, I've lived most of my adult life in France, so I'll tick that box for now, at least in part.
But yet you're talking about structural reform. How can you... Sorry, I'm joking.
No. But think about it. You know, let's turn the clocks back and let's think about what history has taught us about Europe. Back in 1988, we get the Delors report. It tells us we're moving to a single currency. Then we start the process. Then we have one big mess of a currency crisis, 92, 93, in the ERM system. Then we have, you know, the Danes vote no, and big mess from that as well. And then we sort of start to move towards technocratic governments in Italy that do structural reform. We move towards some difficult decisions on convergence, but we have a strong reform movement. And then we get to 1999, we create the single currency, and everyone goes, oof. And we have a bit of a reform pause. And we have a bit of a credit boom, which we're, you know, is in some of the countries in Europe. And what I think now is if you think back to the June meeting, that is our Delors report moment. But I do think getting back to confidence, and that's the challenge globally, is winning back that confidence is a long process. It's not easy to do. And earlier this morning...
But you really don't think, I mean, do you that we could achieve quick progress on growth with structural reform? I mean, so do you think there needs to be some kind of stimulus to get jobs going as well? Or?
Well, I think this is always a very difficult challenge, but I do think this is where Europe as an institution can offer something quite powerful, because we need to do it in a shared way, and this is perhaps where I'm going to sound very French to you. But I do think that the structural funds are a very powerful thing. Think about Greece. Now, from memory, Greece has about 4% of GDP of funds available from the structural funds to be used that are just not getting used. If you think about the idea from the Commission of project bonds, that's something else. Now, project bonds, there are all sorts of regulatory issues around them, but that's where we can get lift from.
There is some
There is a possibility, but I don't want to say it's a good growth scenario. It will be challenging.
Now, I'm getting signaled from the back that we're almost out of time, and they would like us to take a couple of quick questions from the audience. So could we just, are there any hands? The gentleman on the right here, if you could keep your comment to a sentence, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so Espen made this comment that the problems must be solved in Europe, but Americans need to be concerned. It seems to me that I'm more concerned about what's not happening in Europe, and if they're just waiting to be bailed out by the Americans, like this problem, like all other problems, just gets so big that it becomes sort of too big to fail, and someone else solves Europe's problem.
Okay, we'll come back to that question. Is there another question from anyone else over on this side at all? Okay, lady down here. Again, just a sentence.
You mentioned the structured funds. In terms of the structured funds, where at this point is the cohesion fund, what role is the cohesion fund playing, let alone the ISPA funds that are for countries that are looking to become EU countries?
Okay, and then finally there's a gentleman in the blue shirt.
We heard in the introductory remarks about how well the northern tier of the Euro countries are doing, and we all know how poorly the southern tier. Do you see a possibility that the Euro could split into a northern and southern tier?
Okay, I'm going to ask in their closing remarks if our panelists would take on some of those questions, but I would also like to ask you to tell each of us, each of you to say one thing that you'd like to see in the next year, that if we see it happen, will make you feel a lot more optimistic about where Europe is heading. And I'm going to start with the Lithuanian foreign minister.
You know, listening to the discussion, I'm just got once again the confirmation that Europe do not need treaties changes. The treaties which we do have, they are fine, but we do not have a real supervision system which wouldn't let to violate treaties, which became a sad tradition. We know how some countries joined the EU zone. We know that some countries did it in not very fair way. We know how some countries wasted cohesion funds. That's why now we are talking about smart growth. Smart growth, it means that the money should be used in the most efficient way, not just building 2 parallel highways which goes to nowhere. And we do have such a situation in some European countries. That's what for very, very strict supervision system. Let's take a Schengen treaty. We are all in Schengen. And we know that some countries are not obeying the Schengen rules. We are not installing the real border structuring. We are just, I would say, doing nothing. And after that, we're having discussions about illegal immigration. That's what the difference is, how the countries treats the commitments. And here I say only one way, that we should have strong supervision system.
And just the thing that would make you feel make you feel more optimistic. Presumably, apart from your own re-election.
More optimistic, more and more countries thinks in such a way. I would say even I could talk about Nordic bow. What does mean Nordic bow for me? Starting from UK, going around the Scandinavian countries and finishing at that time with Lithuania, or maybe we'll take the Poland and so on. I mean, that we are talking with our colleagues in EU in the same manner, that we should do something. We should do something, because otherwise we could change a lot of treaties if the countries will have no culture, I would say, to obey the treaties. Everything would be useless.
Thank you, Foreign Minister. I know you have to leave.
Yes,
so
I just have to give a quick comment and leave. I'm sorry for that, but I'm chairing a different meeting, and this is the way it is during the General Assembly. But I don't think the argument has been that the US is going to bail out. And actually, it's important to remember, once you mentioned that, it is thanks to the Chinese that the US is going around, because you're spending much more money than you generate, thanks to all the loans you get from China. So careful with that one. But I would just say that I think what is systematically true for the Nordic countries is that we have found a model of a strong state which is pro-market and pro-change and pro-competition. That we have highly competitive economies and also highly responsible social systems that are not fixed on keeping people's job, but to help people to transition from one job to another. And I think the Nordic model and the World Economic Forum in Davos is increasingly, of all places in a sense, are increasingly saying that the Nordic social model is probably one of the best ways to get out of that. And in that one, you can have stimulus, but you only should have stimulus when you know what you use the money for, as you correctly said. Not all these motorways, but actually stimulate what can then be sustainable in the long run. And that's where we're heading, and that's what makes me optimistic to think about the Nordic model being more dominant in Europe. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. EideMichala, Marcussen.
So there was a question on the structural funds. I mean, essentially the structural funds are available to countries within the EU, and there's currently a negotiation on the next budget. So I think it'll be important to see what can be freed up. I fully share the comment they need to be used sensibly. And I think Ireland did a very good job of using their structural funds, and especially using them for education, which I think is one of the keys here. What I'd like to see, I gave you a very long list, but let's just call it powerful progress on structural reform. And if I have to give you one that I'll be watching, it's labour market reform in France. That, I think, will be a good test.
And odds on that?
Odds on that, I'm a little bit concerned that we won't move quite as quickly as I would like to see.
Okay. I'm a little concerned about that as well. But finally, Foreign Minister, Mr. Rinkevics.
Yeah. Just very quickly, 3 points on 3 comments or 3 questions about this issue of watching from the United States at Europe or at Asia. I think that the whole global economy is so interdependent that we keep watching each other. And I think we were watching also debate between the President and the Congress a year ago, I think, when there was a stalemate on budget issues, and then you got some very concerned voices. I was in Singapore and I was talking with business community, with my colleagues in the government. They are very much concerned about everything. So I think that we are pretty much so interdependent that we keep watching each other and keep worrying. And I think it's to some extent very good thing, so that we can really feel that we are so interdependent. On structural funds, and we didn't touch actually on this one, but I would say that when we had our austerity programs cutting everything, structural funds were the only stimulus package we had, and we didn't cut any national co-finance funds for structural funds, so that we kept the economy going. Currently, within the EU, we are debating next multi-annual financial framework for 2014-2020. And here's the biggest debate currently is whether we are going also to keep the existing financial levels or to cut. And here I would say that we have some members who think that we have to cut, like Great Britain, which is referring to their national health system and its budget, that they cannot afford to cut this budget and to keep European budget intact. But what we see is that this common European budget, structural funds, also connecting Europe facility, educational program Horizon 2020, and so on, are actually beneficial as stimulus package for Europe at large and for its member states. So I think this is going to be very tough discussion at level of heads of state and government in November. I understand that they are preparing to take an extra luggage for 4 to 6 days discussion even. But I hope that a solution will be found. But this has been extremely important, at least for us, when we were tackling the crisis. And finally, about this division. At the end of August, 3 Baltic foreign ministers and German foreign minister Westerwelle were writing an article. And basically, I want to say that if we get into the split of currencies and or southern or northern currencies, and to some extent we are creating a new financial Berlin Wall. And I would say that this is something that I would strongly discourage, and that would be the worst case scenario I would ever imagine. So I would do everything to happen so that we avoid such kind of scenario.
Thank you. Well, I think what strikes me most about this conversation is that when I'm normally talking about the euro in New York, there's at least half the people talking who assume it's doomed and is going to break up in some way. And what comes across here is the level of commitment that I think does exist within the European Union to press on with the euro project and to make it work and to actually deepen the political integration of Europe. And I think that's an important thing, that maybe Americans should look to their own history and understand that that can work as a process, maybe painfully. And I think Europe is going to press on with that agenda. I'd like to thank the panel for being extremely stimulating.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.